Russia House. Most of you I see have been here before, but just to say we are a discussion platform, a think tank, and sort of a social club that gathers people, like-minded people that are opposed to the current Russian regime and just want to talk about it. So today we have a very interesting topic with Dr. Jensen. How much stress is Putin regime actually under, and what does the stress mean? And Dr. Jensen, he's a former diplomat and a professor at Johns Hopkins University and a fellow and Foundation for Defense of Democracy. He speaks many languages, and he is a specialist in foreign policy, security affairs, and he served at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow during the 1991 August coup, and his team received the State Department Meritorious Honor Award. And today we're going to discuss, obviously, as I said, the pressures on Putin's regime that are currently evolving more and more, and we're going to talk about the strengths of the system, where these pressures are actually strengthening the system through consolidation, or it's the strain that deepens the vulnerabilities. So, Mr. Jensen, please.
Well, thank you. Good to see some familiar faces in the audience. Again, I'm getting over sinusitis from the rain. So if I go, it's not age, Yulia, it's mileage. First of all, this is not, next week you're having a discussion of Beretta versus Makarov.
The week after.
The week after. Now, I'm a gun owner. I could say that in the era of Trump, and that sounds very interesting.
Yeah, it's a guy that he is very avid. I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in right there. He's a very avid gun enthusiast. He wrote a book about the 50 years of the specific gun that became a standard of U.S. Security forces and police, and I think now it's actually going away. And he would try to compare it to Russian Makarov and how it actually play in the field if anything works out. If anything works out, if anything comes out. Yes.
Great talk. Great talk. I could never admit I was a gun owner before Trump became president. Second is nice to be here. Nice to be here. Second point I want to make is that when you read the listing of the events tonight, I would never end a sentence with to or under. What's the title? What pressure is there?
How much stress is Putin regime actually under, and what does that?
Leave it at that. So under, you when you're editing, wouldn't your editor put the under out further in the sentence? So he wrote that.
I did
because he's a journalist. I'm just teasing.
Journalist.
Anyway, nice to be here. I don't want to talk in too much of a policy, political science way this evening, but I think it's very important to kind of take a snapshot of what is going on around Putin and in the system at what I see in the moment, and not look at who's up or who's down, who's a reformer, all that kind of journalistic, simplified stuff that you see all the time. So I wanted to pose the question and try to answer, what is the Russian regime under stress? So to put it another way, last year, President Trump told Zelensky, of course, in that famous conversation, that Russia has all the cards. And my question would be, does it really? And my answer would be, actually, it obviously does not. And third, that the Russian system, regime, you call it regime, who say, what do you like to call it, regime?
Well,
the Russian regime under Putin is under, I would say, serious stress. And that's not what you hear on the media. That's not what you hear in a lot of places that talk about Russian politics. But I do think it's under serious stress. And I want to talk a little bit about why I think it is. We can talk about whatever you want about afterward. And it's not that Putin is in danger of being thrown out. I don't think he is, although I'm not fully sure. It's that the system is markedly different than it was at the beginning of the war, and it's markedly different than 10 years ago. And Putin, I would say, has some very serious political challenges that people don't talk about very much. I give you two examples. One is uh, as I was riding endlessly around the block tonight trying to park my car, the BBC was on, and it talked about the internet ban in Moscow, a subject that a lot of people pay a lot of attention to. And and you know the basic outlines that people don't like it. You can't use VPNs. It's for security. But if you read the Russian stuff over the past 6 weeks about it, it's very interesting because uh, the consensus seems to be that uh, obviously the ban was in place because of the security threats to the regime, or perceived or invented. But according to several sources, and this is from Telegram channels, but it's still real interesting, is that Putin is not really under control of the ban. Putin told the second directorate chief, whose name is Sidov, that you guys take care of it. And he switched people inside the FSB who take care of it. And then Putin promptly hid for 6 weeks. And if you look at the stories about this subject, there is no linking of Putin to the ban, because it's politically unpopular, at all, until this week, when Putin had an address to the nation, I think on Tuesday, when he finally mentioned it. So what's interesting about this? Number one, that Putin doesn't like to be held up with bad news as a purveyor of bad news. And of course, Putin's poll is for Putin pretty low, 67%, according to this week. And number two is that for all the talk that Putin is in charge of everything, I don't think he really is. And uh, why do I say that? Because according to this very interesting Telegram story, confirmed by some other sources, he told the figure, the head of the second director, I'm sorry, you guys take care of it and do what you want. Now, that's a very interesting thing for a president to say if he's in charge of everything. He must be very confident about what's going on, about his control. But I don't think really that's the case. He doesn't want to be around potential threats to his rule. And certainly the Telegram issue, like the mobilization, like pension reform 8 years ago, 2018, which caused obvious political unhappiness among the Russian electorate, it does make a difference on Putin. And he knows that. And he's not always that confident of what's going on in the country. I think it's pretty good chance we can say pretty confidently that he gets bad information about a lot of things. So this issue of Putin's role, Putin's power, is a very interesting one, and I don't think it's anywhere near as complete as people say. Don't ask me for some sources. You can read a big report I'm coming out soon on the sources. But I think that's probably the case. And if that's the case, then what is going on in the Russian system? The standard cliche is that Putin controls everything. Most notably championed by Michael McFaul, and I don't think the evidence suggests that at all. Putin's power depends on his ability to arbitrate and manage the forces around him. KGB, military, big oligarchs, and all those things. And that's why, if you know, I always talk about the role of the so-called clans are very important, because Putin can't decide what to do when they say, yes, sir. Putin has to keep in mind that he needs to set different clans off against one another to maintain his own power. He's got to be very skillful at that, and he's not always that skillful at that. So when you see Belousov 2 years ago being made the new defense minister, that's not just a question of a cadre change. It's a question of Putin rewarding a certain military industrial clan under Chemezov, because everybody needs to have their share of the pie. And if you perform well, you get promoted. If you perform well and poorly, you get it taken away from you. Second is the Prigozhin uprising, Vestania mutiny, now 4 years ago. And the question really is not, was this the beginning of the end for Putin, although I thought it was at the time. The question is really, what did the Prigozhin rebellion reveal about the internal mechanisms of the Russian state? And you had divisions around Putin there for the world to see. And that to me was shocking. And it remains shocking. And it remains to be analyzed, I think, with sufficient seriousness to give us an insight into where power lies in the Kremlin. But above all, I think Russia today is what they call, in political science, forgive me, intelligent state. It's not an authoritarian regime like Syria was under Assad. It's not an authoritarian regime like Iran was or is under the mullahs and the Republican Guard. It is an intelligent state, which is to say that the special services, and there are more than just one, but the special services formulate the system, the boundaries of the system, who's up and who's down. Secrecy is prized over transparency. You know the whole story. Some of you are from Russia. You know that the situation is. But in the logic of the Russian state, the intelligence services are the key players, and that has profound importance for what may come next. And they should all, I think, watch it very closely. First of all, it's a model of government that Putin has constructed with his cronies. You're too young to remember the phrase managed democracy. They used to call Russia that, implying it was both a democracy and managed. There was a lot of the power vertical you see references to. And I think what the Prigozhin system has proven, especially since the war began, is that it's an intelligent state that I would argue is under some severe stress. It's under severe stress because of the war, which means limited resources. It's under severe stress because of the lack of transparency in the system, the clear evidence that Putin gets bad information.
So what are the indicators
of stress? So he interrupted me.
Yeah. No, I didn't interrupt you. But I just say,
It's depressing.
What are the indicators of this? Indicators of the stress specifically? What did you see? What did you think? What do you think?
The economy. The increased, I would say it's stress on the system, and it's a stress on intelligence services in particular, and it's a stress on Putin. They are his right and left hands. His right hand. And what do you mean by stress? You mean mistakes are made. The most notable one being the decision to invade Ukraine. That says something. And that was prepared not by the military, that was prepared by the KGB. The economy is depressed. I can go into these a little bit more in a second. The economy is having real problems, probably worse than you think. And so what you have is the pie that was this big, and in 2015 was bigger, is now shrinking. And for the reasons we always talk about, the cost of the war and so forth. And so there's a lot more infighting, I think, around Putin about who gets what. And don't say what your sources are. I can give you the sources. And second, Sanavaya, somebody with far more credibility than I have, writes about it a lot. So there's an increased infighting, there's increased competition with one another, and there's increased fighting over a smaller pie. And that creates a stress on the system, let alone the sanctions, let alone they have no friends, let alone this other stuff. Notice that it's not a bottom-up kind of pressure, particularly. It's a elite clanized this, if that's a word. And this is very important to keep in mind. So what's happening is that while the services and let's call it the regime and Putin are good at, I have it listed here, suppressing organized dissent, maintaining elite discipline most of the time, centralizing decision-making, controlling the national narrative about Russia, and absorbing shocks. And certainly their setbacks in the war have been a shock to the system. all of which I think force the regime to adapt to a new environment. And I don't think it's a regime that will easily adapt to a new environment. And that creates a danger for Russia internally, and it creates a danger for Putin in particular. I know I'm being controversial. You look at me skeptically. It also poses a danger for Putin. Remember, and I'm dating myself, in 89, 90, 91, when I was a child analyst at the State Department, the debate was whether Gorbachev could maneuver between Ligachev and Yeltsin forever, balancing the forces in a country that was clearly undergoing change. And in some ways, Putin is doing that, for challenged by that today. He's got to maintain a balance among the elite forces around him. Again, I mapped the clans, these groups around Putin very closely, and there are like 24, 25. I found a new one today, settled on June, and some FSB people. But Putin has to manage this stuff in a way that's increasingly, I think, challenging as the system comes under stress. And the system has to adapt to these new forces, sanctions, the war, bad economy, and so forth. People leaving the country, all the social indicators of a society under stress. He's got to manage all this in a way that allows him to keep his power. And I think he's been successful so far. Gorbachev was successful for a long time too. And then one day of the week, you don't remember, he wasn't, because the system in 89, 90, 91 was going in a way that made it not governable by this way even a reformed Soviet nomenclature could do. So what are the limits of these controls that the system puts on the society? Number one, bad news moves up very slowly. Or Putin hides. He doesn't want to be told that the Ukrainians can pop every town between the border and 175 kilometers. They constantly put out false stuff. If you read, does anybody read the ISW war report here? It's a daily, it's a very good report. The Hudson puts out a good report, and Harvard, my alma mater, puts out a bad report called Russia Matters. And it came out today when I was in traffic on Constitution Avenue. And reading what's going on in the war is very, very hard to do accurately. And it's very clear from the public statements that Putin gets from Gerasimov and Peskov and the others that he's not getting all accurate stuff. Now, maybe they're just lying to him. Maybe we all weep. We know that it's not going well. But when you see one town in Donbass claimed by the Ukrainians, backed up by photo imagery in the West, and then Gerasimov publicly says, no, we control that town. And it's not under control. It's not. It's in control by the Ukrainians, or they're back and forth. But Putin says all this stuff all the time. Third, I think competence may yield to loyalty. Putin picks people who are loyal. He's not the only world leader who does that, rather than competence. Take somebody who's widely respected, Elvira Nabiullina is widely considered top-notch, and there are rumors now that she may be on the way out as well. Fourth, bureaucracies are rigid, and they compete with each other for money and power, or just don't do anything. If you look at the number of, I know I'm talking a long time, but if you look at the number of presidential decrees that are implemented, Yeltsin, Putin orders a decree and nothing happens most of the time. How do I know that? Because there are reports from the ministries that say nothing happens. It's just like the rainwater evaporating we just saw after the storm. So a lot of what Putin does doesn't get translated to action at the other end. And above all, I don't think Russia is good at adapting to crisis. It's rigid. There's lack of control at the top. There's no coordination at the top. Prigozhin is above all the best example. But what's another one? Remember 2 years ago the Kharkiv intrusion by the Ukrainians across the border. That was handled abysmally. Human was put in charge and somebody else was. And this goes on and on and on and on and on. And this, to me, reflects a state that is decaying, increasingly fragile. Fragile not in a collapse way, fragile in a way that suggests it cannot adjust to change, make effective policy. And in the long run, this, I think, will be damaging to the Russian state and Putin much more than it is now. A couple more comments about other warning places that we should pay attention to. One would be the war. And they can't, I'm sorry, I don't care what the Harvard Russia Matters newsletter says on my traffic jam. Russia cannot continue this war forever like this. We've seen the casualty totals. Putin doesn't want to mobilize young men in Moscow or Petersburg because that's a potential for unrest. That's why he calls it a special specjalny военная operation, right? And it's not a vойна, because that would mean you'd have to mobilize people. The economy, we mentioned Nabulin, of course. The economy is very, very distorted by the war. 30% of Russia's, just off the top of my head, 30% of Russia's GNP is on a defense budget. That is higher than the Soviet Union, which was 25%. Nobody here is old enough to remember the Soviet Union, but I do. Third, I forgot to count. Third would be the reshuffling of property. The army has to be paid and fed and all that, and all this property that had been privatized in the 90s had been purchased more or less by so-called businessmen in early Putin era. Now is being reallocated. Very hard to get numbers about this. Stanovai has written about it. Others have, but it's often the government reallocating from one part of the FSB to another one banker to somebody else. It's like that. And of course, this is Russia. Property rights are very weak. And so, again, the instability in the property of resources is, I think, very destabilizing. It rewards loyalty. It does not reward good business practices or sound property management. Third, fourth, fifth, wherever I am, Yulia, fifth, is the ascendancy of the Siloviki, which are all over the place. And I would point out that when you talk about the FSB in particular, it's not just an organization like the CIA or the FBI. It's not just 200,000 FSB officers. They are embedded in every part of the society, in businesses, in schools, and private associations. And there's even different kinds of legal categories for their embeddedness in other parts of the society. So it's a dominant feature of the society. Again, they don't want to take risks. They're nasty people. They run the country, but also gorge on the country's many resources. Third, and I think finally, I would say that the tensions with the regions are growing. A lot of the regions don't like providing men for quota for the army, especially outside Moscow. Economically, they still subsidize the center. All those things we've talked about for many years. But I think now the stresses on the system, all this stuff together, make a system that clearly suggests that Putin doesn't have all the cards. This has led, I would argue, to a instability at the top. I'm not saying he will be ousted. I'm just saying that he's isolated in a way that is very interesting, with real limits on his power, and decisions are made by others. We now have a Telegram channel article which says Putin told the second directorate, turn it off, do what you guys want. That's management? You think the second directorate is going to do less than Putin wants? No, they're going to overfulfill the plan. So everywhere you look, I think you see problems. I'm not going to predict the scenarios. We can talk about that. But I think that I would close with an anecdote from history, which is out of 1916. The Russian army, I had to write it down because I'm a simple guy. Russian army still possessed armies, police forces, ministries, and formal authority at the table of ranks. But by early 1917, the society had lost cohesion, and of course the revolution happened. The institutions fell visibly, but the society had already run down internally, and that's hard to measure. But I think it's one of the central things we should be watching. One of the interesting things about Russia is that the anybody who's from Russia here has Russian family ties. There's a profound difference between formal and informal institutions and relationships in Russia. There is the table of ranks would have Putin at the top, constitutionally, Mishustin, I think, second, whatever, down the line. But the actual power is wielded in informal ways through money, personal contacts, which often have little to do with the real, have more to do with power than who's in the Duma, who's in the Duma, or who's in the Security Council. This is really a challenge for American analysis of Russia because we look at it as though it's like the United States. And in fact, there are many people, Sechin, many others, who are very powerful, Chemezov, who are more powerful than the corresponding political leaders on paper. It's these people you have to pay attention to answer the question which everybody always asks, which is how is Russia ruled? And the answer is it's ruled in a certain way that's very unlike ours. I would say the system is gradually sliding toward crisis, whatever happens in the war. And 3 years from now, I'd be glad to talk about that again.
Well, hopefully we'll see you earlier than 3 years.
Perhaps. I don't know. It depends if the wine improves or not.
But
now, that's my remarks. Now, we can talk about whatever you want. And
okay. So
if this is a little too
you pretty much covered
a little too Brookings, I'm sorry, but you rarely get a chance to talk to an intelligent audience and go beyond the paradigm you see early on the public commentary.
So you said that the Russian elites are fragmented and fragmenting.
They're what?
The Russian elites are fragmented and fragmented. So do you see?
I would say they're unified, but they're not.
Okay. Well, you said there was another group that you just found out about recently.
Yeah.
Do you see a possibility of consolidation or not? Maybe not consolidation, but a forced control over these groups, like
by
strengthening of repression or something like that. Like, let's think about maybe Stalin, who would try to control everything and basically bring everything under his nail. So do you see anything like that happening?
Yeah, I could think that'd be much tighter.
So you think it will get much tighter?
I think it will get much tighter. The regime can enforce controls imperfectly, and they're trying to enforce controls now. And look at the Telegram. I mean, the Telegram, the ban on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good example. But how they do it is almost as interesting as whether they can do it. And they do it. There's all sorts of pockets of power around Putin, and you have to look at who participates in that to see how the controls will be imposed. Can I give you an economic example? If you look at shipbuilding, forgive me for an obscure topic. If you look at shipbuilding, what you think, oh, it's shipbuilding, who cares? But shipbuilding is controlled in Russia shaped in Russia by three major clans, Chemezov, Sechin, and another one. And so all the contracts, this is not about control, but it's about how it works. To build a ship, you have to have the clans paid off in adequate numbers, and that often is a matter of great controversy. So what happens is that ships don't get built on the schedule, and what happens, you have a crisis now of energy, and the Ukrainians, God bless them, are popping everything in sight, and so the problem of regime incompetence bleeds into, and corruption bleeds into how it performs as a security state. And
so when they're not paid off, it slows everything down.
But you can't pay off the three different clans fighting over it. And that happens all the time. If you look at the Russian military presence in Ukraine, Army, Navy, whatever's left of it, Army, Air Force, and all that, the drones, the missiles, these are made by government contracts that are the product of clan bargaining with Putin. And sometimes the decision made to say, build up more, whatever, S-400s, is not the right strategic decision at the moment. It's based on political and other considerations. Now, you might say, this happens in the US as well with Lockheed and all these companies. Not, I think, to that extent. So you have a connection between the system as it's structured and a winding down of Russia's security capabilities and ability to function at home as a state. Now, that's not the same as control, which is different. It's easy to throw people in jail, but it's not easy to throw everybody in jail. And that's a problem. And that's what, you're waiting for the Russians to do something about this. And for those of us who remember the Democratic opposition in the late 80s, the Congress CPD, for example, seemed to have turned the corner, but it slipped back. And it's important to try to understand, and I don't have a good answer why it slipped back. If the transitions to a democracy are not automatic, as we've seen, and why it failed is an important intellectual question, and I don't see anywhere near the attention given to it. Your friend McFall, Yulia, would say, FSBA rolled it back. I would argue that we misunderstood the country to begin with in a way that allows bad policy to be made.
Yeah, I think Russia is very much misunderstood by the U.S. So you would say that the recent military setbacks or stagnation by the Russian army, the advances, it's all a result of this, of all these structural decision making, and all of these infighting and inability to give to somebody while they have to give to someone else. Is that true?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's how it works. Okay. No, but it's important because
But does that translate into a political concept?
Yeah, everything is politicized. Everybody's fighting over money. And again, this happens in other places, maybe even in the United States of America. But in Russia, it's the informal political struggle for resources and power is a fundamental aspect of the system that it's not here. And so everything gets politicized. Shipbuilding, internet policy, everything. And again, so you as a clan leader, let's say you have a few banks, private army, a television station. You as a clan leader, that stuff is tentative. It's not really, well, I know someone who worked once for the Kremlin, and Sergei Ivanov, who said, we have to realize ultimately it's all Putin's money in the sense that, and that I take it from you and I give it to you. And that's not how advanced technological societies do that. Now, Xi in China knows corruption is a problem and tries to crack down on it. But Putin, for Russia, it's not. It's the mother's milk of the system.
It's the structure of the state.
Yeah.
The corruption is the state.
It's not a violation of the system. It is the system.
Yeah, it is the system.
And I've interviewed some people in the security services, and they think it's their privilege when you're a lieutenant in the FSB to steal as much as you can within limits because you're serving the state and all that other stuff. That's
so from Soviet Union. It's like if everything is everybody's and everything is mine. It's kind of like everything is, might not be owned by him, but it's still his because it's just he controls it all. So with all these, how does the war then serve still as a source of legitimacy?
Very much so. Does it or how does it?
How does it?
Oh, I think it's done.
First, with all the setbacks,
for the
all
Russians,
problems, for the Russians, for the Russian people, how can he translate that? Into a source of power?
You said zeitgeist. Yeah. It's the strategic culture of Russia, as we all know, is based on Russia is an empire. Russia has interests in preserving the regime, the Tsar, the Soviet Union, or Putin, that make you have to be strong army, strong military, strong center, and that's what the Ukrainians really are revolting against. And it's called a strategic culture, which is very interesting because if you ask Anatoly Chubais, do you hear of Chubais? Yeah. Chubais was an advisor. You're my age. Yeah, he's probably in the other room. Chubais, I have to be very careful when I say this. A lot of Russians even if they're of a more pro-Western democratic bent. Everywhere I am, I have to be careful. Still have trouble abandoning that imperial attitude. And I think that's one thing that really angers Ukrainians. But if you watch can I say, be frank? If you watch the various diaspora opposition groups, and I know leaders of several, uh, they have a view of Mrs. Navalny is one that's often cited. They have a view of Russia as still a great power, still an exceptional power. Russia should play a role equal with China and the U.S. It's a strategic culture that they inherit that's very different than Ukraine's. And I think that's one of the clashes you see here is between Ukraine as a normal state and Russia as something almost Byzantine and exceptional. And I think a lot of Russians, even in the opposition, still, to me, reflect that imperial attitude, that Moscow and the center. Is that going to lose me friends here? I think that's a very common attitude. Mrs. Navalny and her husband, late regrettably departed, were often criticized for their attitude toward Ukraine by Ukrainians. And that because they could not accept Ukraine as an equal. And that's an attitude of strategic culture that until you change, we and our succeeding generations will have to deal with, I think, for a long time. And that means the chances of Putin leaving and somebody more mild could happen. But we're being followed by somebody who is not imperial about Russia, I think, is a separate thing and less likely because Russians, like Americans, think of their countries deservedly as a great country and have attitudes about the international system that are very different than ours, and we don't seem to be able to take that into account. Germany and Japan changed for reasons we all know.
That right there, you just walked it right into my next question. So, do you see it change? Because I lived in Russia for a long time, Ukraine a long time, now I'm in the United States a long time. I understand what you're talking about. So what needs to happen in order for the Russians to change that mindset, to change that imperial or you know, we can do whatever
To make
we
it a
want
normal country.
to. I did not say that, but sure. Yes,
Yeah,
let's go.
okay. Well, first of all, the system I described has to be dismantled. And
It was already dismantled, and then it was remantled again.
well, it was not dismantled.
No, touche.
We were succeeded by something else, which turned out to be this, but that's another discussion.
Yes.
It has to be dismantled, and I think that's going to take a long time. And I don't think we should expect that a replacement to Putin would probably be milder. He might even want peace in Ukraine, but is he going to regard Moldova as anything other than a former Soviet republic? I don't think the chances are very high at all. How do we do it? Maybe we can't do it at all. Maybe we have to wait. Maybe it's containment. Maybe containment is the answer. And that's very unsatisfying to have to say in front of a bunch of Americans who are always optimistic or were that that's the case. So I think first thing is Putin has to go, and you have to make institutions and public attitudes adjust to the post-Putin era in a way that's constructive.
Do you think this war can potentially change that, like the World War II did for Germany or for Japan even? Is that possible, or you think it has to be more? Because World War II for Germans was a shock, and while a lot of people stayed with the former ideology, we know that there were still people that were maybe not with the former ideology. I'm not going to say about which one, but we understand. But the change was dramatic. Within 20 years, it was completely different. Do you see that in Russia, or again, as you said, it's more gradual over 50 years when we're all gone, and then maybe something changes?
Well, I don't think countries go on one path, but I would say it's going to be more gradual, and the containment and selective engagement probably would help, but don't expect too much. We expected in '91 Yavlinsky's economic reforms to happen was it 60 days? This is crazy. This is crazy. Now, that doesn't mean that Russia won't have great, solid, pluralistic, tolerant leaders. I knew Boris himself very well. He was an example of someone who I would trust to lead the country. But again, uh, the strategic culture hasn't changed essentially, really. In fact, I would argue that one of the interesting things about Russia, even back in its czarist, I saw it like in my talk that I can talk to my students. In its czarist form to today is the continuity of the strategic culture of empire, surrounded by enemies, all that aggressiveness, all of that has been remarkably continual, I think, for a long time. And that means the task will be a long time. Now, back to what you said, Gorbachev softened it. Now, we were at a key inflection point that it might have changed, but it didn't. And why didn't it? Maybe we didn't.
Maybe it's in the minds of the people
Yeah,
themselves.
yeah. The hearts and revolution is ultimately in the hearts and minds of the people. But comparatively, why is Ukraine, and I don't have a good answer, but why is Ukraine clearly European? Talk to young people like you. Uh, they talk just like Europeans do. Ukraine is a Western democracy. It has corruption, has problems, and all that. We know that. Why the difference? And that to me is a cultural difference, not a policy difference, primarily,
Maybe
which,
historically.
yeah, yeah. And that's just it's a remarkable thing. And I don't want to generalize about Russia because Moscow, I realize, is very different from Siberia. And Siberia is a much more open place. I understand that. And that's what we should be encouraged. Just be patient. Terpenia, matuchin.
But the Russians saw all of these good things of the Western civilization, from internet to the products that were flowing after the fall of the Soviet Union, and then it got developed into their domestic products that were on par with the West. Never got the cause right, but so do you think that these these limits and these constraints and blockings, they might break something out? They might uh, change the people's minds and have them really come out, or these preemptive strikes by the government, where we can see where there was that attempt of a protest where, like, let's go just walk the dog. I don't know. Do you know what I'm talking about, right? Uh, and then few people were called in, and it was just called off. Like, we never heard about it again. So will that work? So which one will prevail possibly? Because the young people that I know in a personal experience, they hate that. They understand. They obviously are taught in school a certain way, right? But they understand what's going on in their minds. They hate it. They don't like that they can watch YouTube, but basic things. So which one do you think might break? Would it be one or the other? Breakthrough.
Well, just because they understand what's going on doesn't mean they're not Russian.
Okay.
And that's the difference I'm trying to illustrate here. I've through a project I'm doing, I've interviewed members of the Russian intelligence services, as I talked about. I've interviewed East European officials who are in NATO, and the overwhelming consensus is that in the FSB, younger people are more hardline than the older ones. And that's completely opposite to what I thought. Why? Because they believe the Putin line. Also, that they feel that the corruption detracts the country's greatness in implementing the Putin line about Russia's greatness. So it's hard to generalize about generational change, but I can remember the embassy in Moscow. You write these cables, and the ambassador has to approve it or not, and he adds some comments. I remember somebody you probably heard of always defaulting to the younger generation in Russia, going to be more open and more democratic. Well, maybe they are, but there's been very little institutional evidence of it. And maybe they're just more passive. I don't know. I don't know. But this also brings up policy questions. What should we do about it? And President Trump has one solution. Others have others. I think Ukraine winning frozen conflict, Russia wins or Ukraine wins. And I don't think Russia will win.
Yeah, but frozen conflict is not.
Wait, I don't think Russia will win. I don't think Ukraine will win in the sense that militarily win. I think Ukraine, in all many ways, has already won. Uh, but I'm not, and I think a frozen conflict is the most likely. I don't think negotiations will work at all because that we're dealing with Ukraine being a European democracy and Russia's strategic culture clashing. And how can you compromise on that? Because the Ukrainians are not going to trade land for some promise from Putin. They're just not.
So do you think that frozen conflict might escalate the costs for the Russian economy
Of course it will. Yeah.
to a point where the change will occur? Because that's essentially what happened when Soviet Union collapsed. The costs of the Afghan war and the arms race essentially put so much pressure and other things. Chernobyl was a factor as well. It could basically crack it finally, and we have something else. As we discussed, maybe not,
It could, but it's more likely that
obviously it would take years.
we're talking about frozen conflict.
But yeah, frozen conflict will if it freezes, obviously the resources that Russia had to put in it.
I don't think frozen conflict would provide enough guarantees that the Russians won't be bad actors. But that might be what you have to settle for. I don't know. I hate to be extreme here.
But we're talking about but we're talking about frozen conflicts. It includes costs for Russia to control that line, right? The Bell line, then it also all the controls on the internet, which Russian people are not happy with, all the controls, the sanctions, the fact that the Russian cannot get caught besides Chinese and Korean to some degree. So all of this is making people more and more happy. The regulation by the state with the language. I know personally people who lost their businesses because they had to translate their business name to the Russian name, and now people are just like, we don't even know which one is.
You're talking about, is this a frozen conflict?
Yes, yes. So all of these things will be in the frozen conflict. They will be going on for years.
Yeah.
So all of this pressure, will it eventually break the system?
But I think the frozen conflict would, things would be in place like they are now for years, and there's no agreement about Donbass land. There's no agreement about Western security. It's just Russia's not strong enough to push Ukraine back, and vice versa. That's what to me, a frozen conflict. I think that's the most likely right now. I don't blame the Ukrainians for not wanting to trade Donbass. They shouldn't. But if I could add a note of terror a little bit in this, which is to say that, is this taped?
Yes.
I'm not fully convinced that the Russians will not, if back to the wall, not do something crazy like tactical nuclear weapons.
Oh, okay.
And I'm not sure that that will not happen. And why do I think that won't happen? Because I think some people around Putin, and probably Putin, this is just my impression, are much harder line than Gorbachev and Khrushchev were. And I think that has to be not kept in mind, even despite the incredible pressure from other countries and China in particular not to use it. So I just don't know what Putin will do when cornered. I don't know. And Patrushev and all these people, some of whom are close to retiring, I just don't know. And I don't want to, they're saying what we should be thinking about. The friend I mentioned who works for Sergei Ivanov, who's now in the States, once told me that they're drinking vodka or whatever they drink now. They tell themselves they're not going to go down like Gorbachev did. Okay. And that's scary. And maybe that's just bravado, what you said after 6 vodkas. But it should be kept in mind. When I was at USRP, we had a weekly vote about what Putin would use nukes, tactical nukes, in the war, and that was, remember, the fall of 22 when there's a lot of talk about it. The Chinese evidently told Putin don't use them. But again, you can't automatically assume it won't happen. That's why the Trump administration is right to be not trying to push to Putin against the wall, uh, but we have to be very, very careful. But I don't think any of this Russian behavior will change unless some really more systematic cleanup is done by Russian behavior, and that's very, very hard to do. Very, very hard to do.
Interesting. Well, with this kind of walked in into my last question. So Russia is becoming more isolated. Iran is happening. We're talking about Venezuela, Syria, and they're all knocked out. Well, Venezuela's not exactly knocked out, but yeah. Do you think this puts more pressure and isolates and puts Russia more in the camp of North Korea?
The
Or
war, you mean?
no, all of these events, the Iran situation that's happening right now,
Well, no, I
Venezuela.
think it puts pressure on the other countries to open up Russia to not be as tough.
Interesting.
If that's your question.
Now, my question is, does it put more pressure to move Russia deeper into the control and
Oh,
again
on Russia,
on
yes,
Russia, yeah,
absolutely,
in
absolutely,
more North Korean camp?
yes, absolutely.
Uh,
The turn to China too. I mean, Russians think of themselves.
well,
Uh,
China is more
yeah,
now is
they're
becoming more
turning to the
mild.
east, and I don't see Russia. We've talked about strategic culture ever. Russians ever being comfortable with being an Eastern-focused primarily country. I don't think they want that. But again, they have that for now, and it's going to take a long time to change it because you have people at the top who prefer Chinese technology to opening up Russia, despite what the BBC said when I was in the traffic jam
Yeah, yeah, I saw that. Okay, thank you. I will open up the questions.
Okay. Well, first off, thank you for some great
today. This is just
insights.
what I think, by the way.
I understand. I understand. But what you think is golden, right? So, but I understand what you're saying there. Um, but these are great insights, and you do have, ways of getting information that a lot of us here would not, and therefore can make some assessments. I had a couple of questions, but I don't want to dominate this whole thing. But start with and we were touching on it a little bit already, but is there any kind of pressure from the people? I mean, you got a combination of bad economy, you got all the lives that are being lost, which may not be felt as strongly around Moscow, but it's still there. I mean, that's a significant figure, over 1 million, casualties one way or the other. That's incredible.
1.5 million, yeah.
Well, yeah, and growing, yeah, quickly. So, but is that creating? I mean, that's a lot more than say they had to and when they were involved in Afghanistan and kind of like you just got the hell out of there. But this obviously, and I think everybody, this is Putin's. Putin's not going to pull out of there. I don't think. Or that
Yeah.
I'll pose that as a question.
You're asking if there could be a popular revolt, and I would say no.
Yeah.
In any society, you've got the active minorities pro and against Putin. You've got that large middle group. Oh, yeah, I'm for him. Or, yeah, I'm against him. They're at dinner. The Polar calls and says, za proti Putin. And they, whatever. It's those organized extreme minorities that that you have to worry about. But I don't see they have the interest, ability to organize to do anything to pressure the government anyway. That's not to say that what they think doesn't matter.
Mhm.
You've seen Putin adjust policies based on perceived popular opposition. The pension reform in 2018, people went to the streets, Putin backed off it, and that happened. But that's not the same as a popular uprising, and I don't think you're going to see that. And it's easy to generalize, and because this is the same discussion you and I would have had in 1990, but I don't see it. I think a much greater danger is the elites around Putin. And well, first on the popular, yeah, keep in mind that a third of the Russians want him to be harder line on Ukraine. But but
Is that the elites or the people?
yeah, I think there's a lot of dangers for Putin around in the elites in the
oligarchs.
way that I talked about. And that, so I would expect if a change happened, let's say Ukraine broke through the line, which could happen, and uh, started to bomb Moscow and all that. Putin either could respond with tactical nuclear weapons, or uh, the equivalent of Budanov, who would walk into his office and say, "Hey, bud, you're out of here. Here's a golf membership someplace." Now that could happen, and that's a much more likely thing to happen than what you described.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah, a quick follow on, because we're touching on things that could make an impact. And I did actually report on the Cold War many years ago from Washington, but I did have a trip to Berlin and met with East German officials both before and after the fall of the wall. And one of the things that got pointed to by a lot of people from the West was the ability or the influence that things like Voice of America, Western television, Westernizing, and a lot of the people in Eastern countries were actually having access to a lot of that. So, and by doing so, they could see for themselves that there's a big difference between what they're being told by the government that they and what is happening there. And I point that because now, as we know, Putin is basically taken off. Even Telegraph is now. Yeah. Oh, well, I'm getting to.
We're here for him. Can you ask your question, please?
If you give me a chance, I will.
We all gave you a chance for the last 3 minutes, so please ask your
Okay.
question.
The question is there similar types of pressures or from the people or the influence of the people get from outside sources?
Well,
Or
those
they
sources.
all
Well,
fight?
it's a potential threat, and those sources are cut off now. But I know that they get their information, uh, and that might be very frustrating in their inability to act on it. But it's much harder than it used to be. I was deputy director for Radio Free Europe for 6 years, so I was involved in this. We looked very closely at who listened, uh, and it does make a difference. I had a friend who was a Bulgarian correspondent in RFE who said he grew up in Sofia, and uh, he would go to the embassy's movies every Friday night, and they would open the refrigerator in the movie, Hollywood movie, and it would always have food in it. And no matter what the plot was in the movie, he thought, "Holy moly!" In America, the refrigerators are full, and so little things like that make a difference. And one of my point is that cultural exchanges do make a difference. When I was there in Moscow, they were very pro-American. So yes, it makes a difference, but does it translate into anti-regime activity? I don't know. I mean, they don't have the guns, and I just have to say, I hope so. But look what happened to poor Boris himself.
Yeah, to the point that you were just talking about, quick point is that, and I know it from a personal experience, very personal experience, the support, quiet support by the Russian people, especially middle-aged to older, is far more than you think. It's just far in Russia for Putin, for the regime. Yes. Yeah. So a lot of people think that it's different. No, the support is quite strong there. It's quiet,
Yeah,
but it's quite strong.
there. I have no doubt there's a lot of opposition quite to the war, but can you translate it into stopping what's going on? And that's the problem. In Ukraine, you could because it's a democracy, but it's a sad thing.
People like stability, right? They like stability rather than chaos because America right now. But
Okay, anybody questions? Would you like?
Actually, I got a question. The tenets of those meetings, and they boil down to the following. The Russians had a chance, but then it didn't work. So is it the genetics? Is it the imperial history? Is it? There was recently a similar conversation at Atlantic. There was again a bunch of people who were there in the 90s. So my question is, I was watching from the side, and I'm from Sofia also, so kind of don't have a skin in this game. But in the 90s, the Russians were completely submissive to the United States. They opened all the doors, all the kimonos, and the internal fight between communists and Democrats was based on the assumption that they're rapidly walking towards full integration in the West. There was all the anti-Stalin movies, so everything. So if everybody was basically saying, "Hey, don't go with the communists, go with us. In 10 years, we'll be another Germany." And then I think the Russians learned that the West never actually intended to fully integrate. All this thing in NATO partnership for peace,
Yeah.
So it'll be very interesting to hear from an American expert like you. What did we, and I mean United States, did wrong? Because I never hear that.
Oh,
What did we,
he's got to have me back.
because now you said something for Ukraine, how Ukrainian people are very pro-Western.
Yeah.
The war is going to finish. The focus on the politicians are going to move away from Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to get in NATO. Ukraine is not going to get in the European Union. And there's going to be a massive backlash with the Ukrainian population.
In Ukraine. Could be. People talk about that.
Words. So the same happened with the Russians. At one point, they thought they're going to an open door, and at one point, they figured out the door was just painted on the wall. So
what did we do wrong?
Yes, because
Where'd you say you were from?
I'm Bulgarian.
Okay.
But I've been here for
My first diplomatic posting was in Sofia.
Oh my God, we're gonna have a drink later. So.
Great, good one, good wine.
Sure.
Well, let me talk about what I was involved with, because he asked, what did we do? What did we do wrong? What did we do wrong?
Right.
We and I wrote cables to that effect. We thought that, we assumed that, I miss Bulgaria, by the way. We assumed that what happened in Eastern Europe in 1989 and 90 would happen in Russia, that it was the same thing. And it wasn't. Forgive me if I say even Bulgaria was a European country with a history, a more rule of law and all that stuff. It was still occupied. So we assumed that the process would be the same. This is just my view. I remember talking to a very prominent economist who you probably know, but I won't mention his name. And I said, well, this is going off the rails in Russia. It's not working. And whether it worked in Poland, I was told that many times. It worked in Poland. So we assumed the process would be the same.
So you know how Poland was treated differently. Laws were forgiven.
Yeah.
They were promised immediately back to negative.
Yeah.
That's my point.
Yeah.
There was a path that motivated the people.
But see, that gets to my second point. What we did wrong is we thought that the breaking of Soviet power would automatically lead to a more democratic system. And you remember, you're probably too young to remember shock therapy, the debates about all that stuff. This is nonsense. But we assumed that this stuff was more the transition would be more or less automatic, and it wasn't. And it took us and once things started, so those two things, once things started to go off the rails, we started to blame Russia for failures of policy. The failure was, yes, Russia they were not doing things we wanted, but part of it is because we misperceived the problem and the lack of rule of law. My friend Paul Goebel, you may have heard of him. He said, well, Americans think that history doesn't matter. Second, and foreign policy. Second, we think that culture doesn't matter. And third, we think that for every problem, there must be a solution. And fourth, and this would be my addition, we think that if there's no solution, there must be no problem. And that to me epitomizes the problem of the 90s. I came back, there was something called loans for shares, where Yeltsin, needing money, would give companies away to rich oligarchs, starting the current oligarchic system. And I remember telling a very senior person when I came back from Moscow in '96 uh, about this. And he said, "What's loan for shares?" I wanted to say, like, didn't you read our cables from the political section? What are you doing? So that kind of mirror imaging happens all the time. So now you see that often that Russia has retreated from democracy. It never was a democracy. So why you? It could have been, as you said, but it's not. Ukraine made it, I think, and Poland. Look at Poland, a major power in Europe. Bulgaria, at least until last weekend, made it. But you see my point. You see my point. So history and these things matter, and I think we had a lot of policies that didn't take those sufficiently into account. That would be my guess. And we would write that. Final anecdote. Am I holding you too long? Fine. Oh, you may remember '91 was the coup, but '93 was a shootout on the streets of Moscow, and I was under gunfire for a couple of days. I lived on Ambassador Pickering's wide hors d'oeuvres in the refrigerator. But we essentially, we the U.S. approved Yeltsin's closing the parliament and implicitly shooting up the parliament because we said the anti-Yeltsin parliamentarians were not democratic. But 2 years before, the Congress of People's Deputies, which elected those people, was praised by the U.S. as democratic. What? So, you have these principles and sometimes you make more expedient decisions. And so we made a lot of mistakes. That doesn't excuse Putin's behavior, but, and so even now you see references to Russia's transition after *91. Why is it a transition? It was after '91. The country was in ruins and a lot of mistakes were made. And I leave it at that because it's very complicated and very painful to see, given how well regarded the Americans were in '91, '92. So thank you for putting up with my pontificating. Thank you for, as always, elegant moderation.
Thank you. Well, it was easy. With you, it was easy. Thank you so much. Yeah, please.
I'm always available, by the way. I'm a teacher at Hopkins. I teach Russian foreign policy, do a lot of media TV work. If you ever have a question, shoot me an email. I'm glad to. But again, you mentioned our age. We're not that old. It didn't happen all that long ago.
And that's what kills to us.
Yeah.
Now I talk to people who are 30 and they think that.
Yeah, and I tell my students.
It's wrong history.
Yeah, growing up in the '70s and '80s, the Cold War was a great titanic struggle. I still read Jean Le Carré spy novels, all that stuff. But I asked my students, what I write about the Cold War? It's like, well, there was a Cold War, and there was Russia, and then there was us. It's very, very flat in its understanding before your time of what was. You remember the titanic struggle of civilization? Yeah, and China. Yeah. And it's important there are many, many lessons from that period that we still need to internalize, even for us. So, thank you.
Please enjoy. If you can donate, there's